Hey, Nick.
Hey, Mike.
How's things?
Good. Yeah. Got to see my parents today, which was nice.
Oh, fantastic. How are they?
Yeah, they're good. They're good.
Yeah.
For a nice walk.
Yeah. Oh, they must have been overjoyed to see you. That's really sweet. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. Oh.
How about you?
Was it lots of a whole day of catching up with them, was it?
Yeah, I mean, most of a day. Like they couldn't get here until sort of midday, but we sat and had lunch like with them outside.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. It's really cool. So was that outside at the little cottage, or did you go to like a restaurant or something? Or?
No, outside of the cottage.
Yeah. Oh, fab. Yeah. Yeah. So all good, thanks. Yeah, just been speaking with a friend over in Freiburg, which is cool.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, she's just fantastic. Love her lots. So it's always really brightens my day whenever she calls. She's lovely. So yeah, I've got two people in Freiburg, Andrea and this other friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, bizarre that I've got two friends in. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So it's all good. Hi Frankie. Hi Duncan.
Hi sweeties.
How are you all?
I'm very well.
You've got a sparkly jacket on.
You say you're looking very sparkly there, Frankie.
Thank you. Like I thought that it's warm enough in here that I don't want to wear a jumper, but it's not quite warm enough that I want a shoulder.
Ooh.
So I thought I would put
Yeah.
a little scarf thing on.
Fabulous.
Yeah, that's my exciting.
It's good that you're
the
warm.
exciting
That's good to know.
thing that is happening in my life at the moment.
Oh, how's your day been?
Oh.
Oh goodness. You tired? You okay?
I'm very tired.
Oh no.
I'm like
How come?
properly tired.
Why? What's happened?
I don't really know. I think probably life is happening. I think I'm probably living in the same world that everybody else is, and sometimes that's just pretty tiring. But it's all good. I'm well hydrated, which is the important thing, and had a little bit of chocolate.
Oh, fabulous. That's allowed. That's a treat. That's good. Yeah. Hey, Bina.
Oh, good. Hi, Bina. Who have we got? Who have we got? Let's say hello to everybody. Hello, beautiful people. Hey, Bina. Hey, Kitty and Rory. Hi, Malcolm. Mysterious lurking Malcolm.
Mysterious lurking Frankie.
Hey, man.
I guess.
Who else forgets that? Is that a Katie? Do we have a Katie as well?
We
Or is
have
it
a Katie.
simply? Hello, Katie.
Hey, Katie. I saw Bina's badges there for a second as well.
Bina's badges, you say?
Full compliment.
They look so good.
Can I make a very important announcement?
Yeah.
Okay. So you know how sometimes you have like small things that are definitive grown-up experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent the entire evening just saying to Kitty periodically, "Can you hear the washing machine?" And I know I'm like, exactly. Because I got a good rubberized mat to put underneath it. Like, I'm weirdly proprietorial about it. I'm on the verge of going downstairs to like tell the neighbor you're welcome.
You definitely should do that. I'm so impressed.
Our downstairs neighbor is too attractive to talk to, so we can't
She's
talk.
beautiful, and she makes jewelry from sea glass.
And she's like got this long red hair.
Yeah, she's like a ginger Zoe Deschanel.
Is she actually the Little Mermaid?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe that makes sense.
Well, she sounds unutterably dreamy. Where is she? Why isn't she? Why is it? Would she like to come along?
You know what? There's a non-zero possibility. I would go down and extend an invite.
Hi, Andrada. Hello. Hi, Andrada. Hi, Martin. Hi, sweetie.
Oh, Jen, you look so cozy.
In the rain.
I am a cozy boozy.
Oh.
That is very cute. Cozy is good. Today is a good day for cozy, I think.
I just realized we can't invite her because then she'll watch these episodes to catch up. And then, oh no, Rush, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Storytime
We're going to move. We'll move. We'll stop acting now. It's okay.
Yeah, you move, but leave the mat under the washer for the next residence. Oh well. Oh no, hold on. How can we get by this? Okay.
Well, we've got a Christmas special coming up, haven't we?
Yeah. Wait. What's her name? Do you know her name?
Rosh.
Rosh. Oh, okay. Rosh, if you're watching this, just stop listening for a second, okay? Just like give us like 30 seconds. We need a plan. She's not listening for the moment, but we've only got a very brief period of time. How are we gonna okay.
Hype this conversation.
Can Kitty seduce her with sourdough bread and bramble jam?
Yes.
Could
Yes.
cast modify memory and
Yes.
make us forget this.
Or can we pretend that you have another very attractive downstairs neighbor that we might be oh no, okay, we're out of time. She's gonna, hi Rosh. Hi. How's it going? Yeah, me too. That's so funny. We have so much in common. Weird.
You gotta kiss the girl.
Oh dear. Oh, now I have to take the scarf off. Now I'm too hot. It's Rosh. It's having you here. I'm sorry. I just, getting
Hey, Frankie.
overheated.
Hey Frankie, that's some really good storytelling that you've got doing here. You're the story master. Please let's not do that. It would make me feel very awkward.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Oh. So who else? Who's ginning in the rain? Mike, is that you? Is that you?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, of course it is. How are you doing, Sweet Pea?
Okay, not too bad.
Always excited to see your names. Malcolm, how is your bathroom going?
He's muted. He needs to go to his laptop and turn off the mute.
Actually, that looks like it's going to be a pain in the ass. Sorry.
I'm only doing it during story time, so it hasn't progressed since yesterday.
Ah, I see.
The rest of the time is, other activities of the day.
Very understandable.
Very squeaky ladder though, so I shall mute.
You need like a rubber mat or something to put under it. I hear that's the best thing for when you have loud homewares. See what I did there? Don't you shake your head at me. You shake your head at me. You love it. How are we doing for time, by the way? Hi, Michael. How are we doing for time? Is it good? Are we good? 1 minute.
Who's holding their finger up?
Hi, Ashura. Nice to have you back. I'm so excited to watch this. Oh, so excited. I should stop saying I'm so excited. I'm mildly excited to watch this back tomorrow and being able to see. I like when everyone holds up their hands or makes the same gesture at the same time, because this is on my phone. I can't see it all. So when I watch the videos back, it's a mild pleasure for me seeing everybody.
Oh.
No, I'm embarrassed now. You guys talk for a bit.
Story time. Story time.
Yeah. Think about story time. Okay. Right, let me. Okay. Now. Very sort of slight content warning for this one. I think it probably should be okay, but there are a couple of mentions of suicide, of the concept of suicide is. Nothing is kind of in the thing, but it comes up in the writing, and so content warning there for if that is necessary for anybody. But other than that, I think we should all be fine. Okay. Are you sitting comfortably? I desperately want to know what Nick and Katie are eating, but we'll find that out later. You're sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. The Djinni walked through the streets with swift relief. He travelled north and east, choosing his turns at random, enjoying the cold air on his face. The restlessness of his pent-up nights had turned him lonely, and now, without quite consciously willing it, he found himself heading for the Winston mansion. It was early enough that the elevated was still running. The Djinni purchased his ticket and waited with the crowd. But when the train came, instead of boarding, he stepped between two cars, onto the metal platform above the coupling. He braced himself and held on as the train lurched away. It was a wild, giddy ride. The noise was deafening, a rattle and screech that penetrated his entire body. Sparks from the track leapt past, blown by a violent wind. Lamplit windows flashed by in bright, elongated squares. At 59th Street, he jumped out from between the cars, his body still shaking. It was past midnight now, and the genteel thoroughfare of Fifth Avenue was nearly deserted. He reached the Winston mansion and found that the hole he had created in the fence had been repaired. He wondered what they had made of that, and smiled to think of their consternation. He removed the same 2 bars and stepped through. The garden was dark and silent, the windows on the upper stories unlit. Climbing to Sophia's room was even easier now that he knew the route. In a matter of minutes, he was standing on her balcony, gazing through the beveled glass. Sophia lay in her bed, asleep. He watched her chest rise and fall beneath the covers, piled deeply against the night's chill. He placed a hand on the door handle. To his surprise, the door moved under his hand. She had left it open. Only a crack, but open. The hinges were well oiled and silent. Slowly, he opened the door just wide enough to pass through and then closed it again. His eyes adjusted to the dark of the room. Sophia's face was turned toward him, her hair tangled across her pillow. He felt an unexpected pang of guilt at the thought of waking her. After so long spent in his cramped rooms, the space felt shockingly large and opulent. The walls were upholstered in a fine dove-grey fabric. That sounds lovely. An enormous ornate armoire took up most of one wall. A porcelain washing basin and a pitcher of water rested on a marble-topped table next to the bed. Under his feet was a white rug made from the hide of something large and furry. A nearby movement startled him, but it was his own reflection, multiplied in a 3-paned mirror. The mirror was set on top of a narrow dressing table covered with bottles, gilt-backed brushes, small delicate boxes and other trinkets, including the bird in its cage, looking a bit lost amid the clutter. He went to the dressing table and examined the mirror. Its quality was exceptional, with no flaws or distortions. He wondered at the technique. Even had he all his powers, he never could have achieved such precision. Then he turned his attention from the mirror to his own face reflected in it. He'd seen it before, of course, but never so clearly. A broad forehead, dark eyes set below dark eyebrows, a chin that came to a rounded point, a strongly angled nose. Strange that this was truly he. In his old life, he'd never concerned himself about physical appearance. He'd merely thought jackal and become one, giving no thought to the particulars. He had nothing against the face in the mirror. He supposed his features were pleasing enough, and he was certainly aware of the effect they had on others. So why did he feel as though he'd been robbed of some essential choice? Movement behind him, and a gasp. Sophia was sitting up in bed, staring at him, her face white. "It's only me," he whispered quickly. "Ahmad!" One hand had raised in fright. She sighed now and let it drop to the covers. "What are you doing here?" "Your door was open." It came out awkwardly, like an excuse. She looked to the door as if puzzled at its betrayal. But then she said, "I started leaving it open. After..." She rubbed her eyes, took a deep breath and started again. "For a week I barely slept. I left the door open every night. And then I decided you weren't coming back. Some days I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing." She said the words quietly, without emotion. "But I never could, quite." "Should I leave?" "Yes," she said. "No. I don't know." She rubbed her eyes again, but now the gesture spoke of some inner conflict. She stood from the bed and drew a dressing gown about herself, keeping some distance between them. She regarded him. "Why did you come back now, after so long?" "To see you again." It sounded insufficient even to his own ears. She laughed once, quietly. "To see me? I thought it might be for something else." He frowned. This was growing ridiculous. "If you want me to leave, you only need to say..." But in one brief moment, she crossed the distance between them. Her arms slid around him and her lips covered his, ending his words and then his thoughts. This time she allowed him to carry her to the bed. Afterward, they lay together beneath the tangled covers, and he held her. The sweat of her body pricked at his skin. Slowly, his thoughts came back. It was strange. This second tryst had been more satisfying physically. They'd had more time to explore and respond to each other and let their pleasure build. But he found that he preferred their first. Danger and transgression had charged that encounter. Now, lying in this gigantic bed with its drapes and covers, his lover half asleep in his arms, he felt merely out of place. "You are so very warm," she murmured. He trailed a hand idly across her hip and said nothing. He could hear small movements in the house, a servant walking downstairs, the creaking of pipes. Out beyond the garden, a horse went by at a slow trot, its hooves ringing distinctly against stone. He felt, against his will, his restlessness begin to surface. She turned in his arms, nestling into his chest. Her hair tickled his shoulder. He brushed a few strands away. Her hand came up to entwine with his and found the iron cuff. He stiffened. "I hadn't noticed this," she said. Her head came up from his chest as she examined it. He felt her tug at the slender chain that held the pin. "It's stuck," she said. "It doesn't open." "Then you always wear this?" "Yes." "But it's like something a slave might wear." He didn't answer. He didn't want to discuss it, not in this room, not with her. She rose to one elbow above him, her expression worried and frankly curious. "Ahmad, were you a slave? Is that what this means?" "It's none of your concern." The words rang sharply between them. She flinched and pulled away. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice edged with hurt. "I didn't mean to pry." He sighed inwardly. She was only a child, and it was not her fault. "Come here," he said, and reached for her. After a moment, she relented and drew in close, returning her head to his chest. He asked, "Have you ever heard of the Djinn?" "You used that word before," she said. "Is that the same as a genie?" "When I was young, I had a picture book about a genie who was trapped in a bottle. A man released him, and the genie gave the man 3 wishes. Trapped. Released. If he winced at the words, she didn't notice. He said, "Yes, the Djinn can become trapped. And sometimes they have it in their power to grant wishes, although that is very rare. But every one of them is made of a spark of fire, in the way that men are made of flesh and bone. They can take the shape of any animal, and some of them, the strongest, have the power to enter a man's dreams." He glanced down at her. "Should I go on?" "Yes," she said, her breath warm on his chest. "Tell me the story." He said, "Many, many years ago, there was a man, a human king named Suleiman. He was very powerful and very canny. He gathered the knowledge of the human wizards and increased it tenfold, and soon he'd learned enough to gain control over all the Djinn, from the highest, most powerful to the lowest, meanest ghoul. He could summon any of them at whim and give them tasks to do. He made one Djinn bring him the most beautiful jewels in all the land, and made another fetch endless basins of water to feed the gardens of his palace. If he wanted to travel, he would sit on a beautiful woven carpet, and 4 of the fastest Djinn would pick it up and carry it with them as they flew." "The flying carpet," Sophia murmured. "That was in the story." He went on, his voice a whisper, his words all but swallowed by the hush of the room. "The humans revered Suleiman, and long after his death they still spoke of him as the greatest of kings. But the Djinn resented Suleiman's power over them. When he died and his knowledge was scattered to the winds, they rejoiced at their freedom. But it was rumoured among the oldest of the Djinn that one day the lost knowledge would be found. Mankind, they said, would again be able to bind even the strongest Djinni to its will. It was only a matter of time." He stopped. The story had poured out of him. He could not recall ever speaking so much at once. Sophia stirred. "And then?" she whispered. "Ahmad, and then what?" He stared up at the flat white ceiling. Yes, he thought, and then what? How could he explain how he'd been bested when he himself didn't know? He'd pictured it often enough. A spectacular battle, the valley shuddering and the walls of his palace cracking as he traded blows with his foe. He imagined, he hoped, that it had been a close contest, that perhaps the wizard had even been gravely injured. Could that be why he had no memory of it? Had he won in the end, but too late? The frustration of not knowing coiled inside him like a viper. And how would Sophia ever understand? To her it would be a child's tale, a dead legend from long ago. "That's all," he said at last. "I don't know how it ends." Silence. He felt her disappointment in the tension of her body, the changing of her breath, as if it had mattered to her somehow. After a moment, she pulled away from him to lie on her back. "I'm sorry, but you can't be here in the morning," she said. "I know. I'll leave soon." "I'm engaged," she said suddenly. "Engaged?" "To be married." He took that in. "Is he to your liking?" "I suppose so. Everyone says it's a good match. We'll be married next year." He waited to feel jealousy. None came. They lay together for a few minutes more, their bodies separated, only their hands brushing. Her breathing grew more even. He surmised that she was asleep. Carefully, he rose from the bed and began to dress himself. Dawn wouldn't break for hours yet, but he wanted to be gone. The thought of lying motionless next to her for hours was more than he could bear. The button of his shirt cuff caught on the chain at his wrist, and he cursed under his breath. When he straightened from dressing, he saw that she was watching him. "Will you come again?" she asked. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," she said. "Then I will," he said, turning to leave. And he did not know if either or both of them were lying. Night fell in the Syrian desert, a cold spring night. Earlier that day, a lone Bedouin girl and her doting father had both looked down into the valley and had seen a shining palace that could not possibly be there. And now, lying in her family's tent beneath a pile of hides and blankets, Fadwa began to dream an unusual dream. It started with a mix of images and emotions, at once portentous and meaningless. She glimpsed familiar faces, her mother, her father, her cousins. At one point, she seemed to be flying across the desert in pursuit of someone. Or was she being chased? And then it shifted, and she was in the middle of an enormous caravan, hundreds of men marching through the desert, on foot and on horseback, their eyes dark and stern. She walked among them, jumping up and down and shouting, but they took no notice, and her voice was only a thin echo. She realized that this was the caravan that her father had seen when he was a young boy. It had been there all this time, travelling on its endless path. But now it was herself, not the caravan, that was the phantom. An unnamed fright filled her. She had to stop the caravan. She stepped directly in front of one of the men, bracing herself, clenching her fists. The impact knocked her off her feet as easily as if she were made of nothing at all. She spun and fell. Dizziness took hold of her. Finally, she landed with a jarring thump and lay sprawled on the ground, gripping cool, sandy soil between her fingers. She waited for the whirling to stop and opened her eyes. A solitary man was standing over her. She staggered to her feet and took a few steps backward, wiping the dirt from her hands. He was not one of the caravan men. He wore no travelling clothes, only a spotless white robe. He stood taller even than her father. She searched his features and did not recognize him. His face was bare, not even a hint of a beard, and to her eyes it gave him a strikingly androgynous appearance, despite his obvious masculinity. Could he see her, unlike the caravan men? He smiled at her, a knowing smile, and then turned and walked away. It was clear he wanted her to follow him, and so she did, making no effort to muffle her footsteps. A full moon was rising over the valley, although some part of her knew it couldn't be so. In the waking world, the moon was waning, close to new. She followed him to the edge of a small hill, where he paused, waiting for her. She drew to his side and realized that they were standing on the crest where she'd seen the mirage. And indeed, there in the valley beneath them was the palace, whole and solid and beautiful, its curves and spires glowing in the moonlight. "This is a dream," she said. "True," said the man, "but the palace is there regardless. You saw it this morning, and so did your father." "But he told me he saw nothing." The man cocked his head as if thinking. The world spun again, and then she was down in the valley below, looking back at where she'd just been. It was daylight. Her father was standing on the crest. She knew it was him even from this distance, and she could see, with eyes somehow stronger than her own, the shock and fear on his face. He blinked and then backed away from the hillside, and Fadwa felt a quick stab of hurt at his lie. She turned back toward the tall man, and day melted once more into night. In the impossible moonlight, she studied him with a frankness she would never have shown when awake. Distant pinpricks of golden red flickered in his dark eyes. "What are you?" she said. "A Djinni," he said. She nodded. It was the only answer that made sense. "You aren't afraid?" he asked. "No," she said, although she knew she should be. This was a dream, but not a dream. She looked down and saw her own hands before her, felt the cool earth under her bare feet. But she could also feel her other body, her sleeping body, sheltered in the warmth of blankets and hides. She existed in both places at once, and neither seemed more real than the other. "What is your name?" he asked. Her back straightened. "I am Fadwa, daughter of Jalal in Karim of the Hadid." He bowed, matching her solemnity, though with a hint of a smile. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Only to talk. I mean you no harm. You interest me, you and your kind." He leaned back on a deep cushion, his eyes still watching her. She looked around, surprised. They were in an enormous glass room. Moonlight shone through the curving walls, bathing the floors a bright silver blue. Rugs and sheepskins were scattered across the floor. She and the man were facing each other, seated on cushions of a beautiful weave. "This is your palace," she said, realizing. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." "But why bring me here? I thought that the Jinn feared humans." He smiled. "We do, but only because we're taught to." "We're taught to fear you as well," said Fadwa. "We aren't supposed to whistle after dark because it might attract you. We pin iron amulets on our clothes and tie iron beads painted blue around babies' necks for protection." "Why blue?" he asked, puzzled. She thought. "I'm not sure. Are you afraid of blue?" He laughed. "No, it's a good enough colour. Iron, though," and he bowed to her, a dip of the head, "that I do fear." She smiled, amused at his double meaning, for the word for iron was hadid. Her host, her guest, was watching her. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "What is your life like? How do you spend your days?" The intensity of his gaze flustered her. "You should ask my father or one of my uncles," she said. "Their lives are much more interesting." "Perhaps someday I will," he said. "But now everything is interesting to me. All is new. So please, tell me." He seemed sincere. The soothing glow of moonlight, the delicious warmth of her other sleeping body, a handsome man's gratifying attention, all conspired to put her at ease. She relaxed onto her cushion and said, "I wake early in the morning, before the sunrise. The men leave to tend the sheep, and my aunts and I milk the goats. With the milk we make cheese and yogurt. I spend the day weaving and mending cloth and baking bread. I fetch water and collect firewood. I watch out for my brothers and my cousins and bathe and dress them and make sure they don't get into trouble. I help my mother cook the evening meal and serve it when the men return." "So much activity. And how often do you do these things?" "Every day," she said. "Every day? Then you never simply go about and see the desert?" "Of course not," she said, surprised by his ignorance. "The women must take care of the home while the men are busy with the sheep and the goats. Although," she said with a hint of pride, "my father does let me tend a few goats from time to time when the weather is good. And sometimes we women must do men's work as well as our own. If a tent collapses in the wind, a woman's arms will lift it the same as a man's. And when we move our encampment, then all must work together. She paused. Far away, that other body, her sleeping self, was stirring. In the distance, she heard the sounds of the morning, a child's yawn, footsteps, a baby mewling with hunger. The glass walls of the palace were growing dim and distant. "It seems I must go," the man said. "But will you speak to me again?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "When?" "Soon," he said. "Now, wake." He bent over her, and his lips brushed her forehead. She felt it somehow in both waking and sleeping selves, and a thrill ran through her, down to her bones. Then she was awake, staring up at the familiar walls of her tent, which were billowing in a breeze that felt strangely warm for a spring morning. The details of the dream soon faded, as all dreams must, but certain things remained clear. Her father's face as he glimpsed the impossible palace, the way the moonlight had picked out the angles and hollows of the man's face, the searing touch of his lips on her skin, and his promise that he would come again. If that day Fadwa smiled to herself more than usual, the way a girl might if she were thinking on a secret, then her mother did not notice. Chapter 10. Damp winds blew through the forest outside the city of Konin. In his dilapidated shack, Yehuda Shalman sat in a half-rotted armchair, an old blanket about his shoulders. Dead leaves and scraps of paper skittered across the dirt floor. The fire in the hearth guttered and spat, and Shalman found himself wondering, what was the weather like in New York? Were Otto Rottfeld and his golem sitting by their own fire, blissfully whiling away the hours? Or had the furniture maker already tired of his clay wife and destroyed her? Caught himself and scowled. Why this unending preoccupation with Rottfeld? Usually he spared no second thought for his customers and their illicit acts. He took their money, gave them what they wanted, and slammed the door in their faces. What made this one so different? Perhaps it was the golem. He'd worked hard on that creature, much harder than he usually did for someone else's benefit. It had been a pleasing puzzle to bring Rottfeld's disparate requests together in one creation, and he'd regretted that he wouldn't see it brought to life. Though likely that was for the best, given the unpredictable nature of golems in general. Far safer to be on the other side of the ocean, and not with Rottfeld when he reached New York and woke his bride. Scowling again, he resisted the urge to shake his head like a dog. He had no time for this. Rottfeld's money was nearly gone, and even with all his studies, he was still no closer to his quarry, the secret of unending life. Beneath the straw-stuffed bed in one corner of the shack was a locked chest, and inside that chest was the sheaf of papers he'd taken from a burnt synagogue long ago. The brittle fragments were now interleaved with fresh pages on which Shalman had written formulas, diagrams, observations, trying to fill in the gaps in his knowledge. It was both a chronicle of his studies and a diary of his travels. After that day in the synagogue, he'd wandered from town to town, shtetl to shtetl, through the kingdom of Prussia to the Austrian Empire to Russia and back, searching for the missing pieces. In Krakow, he had sought out a woman rumoured to be a witch, stolen her knowledge and turned her mute to keep her from cursing him. One spring he'd been chased from a Russian village after every pregnant ewe within 3 leagues gave birth to a 2-headed lamb. Someone had thought to accuse the strange Jew of witchcraft. Rightly, as it happened, though in their zeal they'd also chased out a harmless old midwife and the village idiot. In Lvov, he'd visited an old rabbi on his deathbed and taken on the guise of one of the Shedim, The demon children of Lilith escaped from Gehenna to torture him. In this way, he forced the terrified rabbi to reveal that he'd once seen a formula for something called the water of life. But when Shalman pressed him for more, the old rabbi's heart burst. Shalman watched the rabbi's soul pass beyond his reach, and he'd howled with anger and frustration, looking even more like a demon from Gehenna than before. After that, he'd mostly ceased his wanderings and settled close to Konin. He was growing too old. The roads were full of dangers, and he couldn't dodge them all. But always, every day, he drew closer to the death he was desperate to avoid. Staring into the fire, he made his decision. He couldn't afford to spend the winter brooding over an ill-mannered furniture maker. Best to scratch the itch and be done with it. He stood and put on an ancient overcoat, wincing as his bones creaked. From his workbench he fetched a wide basin and went outside. An unseasonable snow had fallen in the night. Kneeling, he scraped heaping handfuls of snow into the basin. Returning to his shack, Shalman placed the basin near the hearth and watched as the snow slumped and melted. He wished it hadn't come to this. When the last crystals disappeared, Shalman pulled the water-filled basin from the hearth. He fetched the broken book from its chest and leafed through the relevant pages, checking that he had remembered the formula correctly. From a leather purse, he took one of the coins with which Rotfeld had paid him. Then he sat cross-legged on the dirt floor in front of the basin of water. Gripping the coin tightly in his left hand, he muttered a long incantation. With his right, he carefully picked up the basin. Another incantation, a deep breath, and then he leaned back and tipped the basin over his head. The shock of frigid water on his face, and then he was gone. He was elsewhere. There was an immense weight on his chest. An eternity of water lay above him, pushing down, breaking his body and grinding his bones. He had never been so cold. He felt the nibblings of 1,000 tiny teeth. A sucking blackness stretched in every direction. The corner of his mind that was still Shalman realized that Rotfeld had never even made it to America. All that toil and for nothing. Unwoken, the golem would have fallen apart by now. An unclaimed wooden crate filled with mouldering earth and a soiled dress. A pity. And then, unexpectedly, the scene changed. The weight above him was gone. He was no longer buried beneath the ocean, but flying above it, moving low and fast, faster than any bird. Shifting water disappeared behind him, mile after mile. The wind roared in his ears. In the distance, a city grew. He rose higher as he approached until he was floating far above it. The city was spread across a hemmed-in island. Towers and church spires pointed up at him like lances. He stared down at the narrow streets and saw that this city was also a labyrinth. And, like all labyrinths, it hid something precious at its heart. What did it hide? A voiceless voice whispered the answer. Life unending. Shalman surfaced, coughing. The basin lay upside down on the floor. Freezing water dropped from his clothes and face. His left fist burned. The coin had turned colder than ice. For the rest of the day, he lay huddled and shivering on his bed, wrapped in every blanket and rug he owned. His joints ached and his frostbitten palm set jaunts of fire up his arm. But he was calm, and his mind was clear. The next morning he rose from his bed, ran his fingers through his beard, and went into town to buy a steamship ticket for New York. On a cold and wet autumn morning, Michael Levy arrived at the sheltering house to find the stoop plastered with flyers printed in Yiddish from a group calling itself the Jewish Members of the Republican State Committee. The flyers urged all self-respecting Jews to cast their lot with Colonel Roosevelt for governor. After all, Roosevelt had recently trounced the Spanish at San Juan Hill, and had not the Jews once been robbed and cast out by Spain and hounded by its inquisitors? Vote to express your approval of Spain's defeat, the flyer cried. Michael peeled them from the rough stone as he passed and squeezed out the water before tossing them in his office wastebasket. Synagogue advertisement he could abide, but not shameless vote-mongering from Republican elites. It had been a difficult autumn for Michael. He'd stretched the sheltering house budget to its breaking point and still did not know how they would make it through the year. The price of coal climbed ever higher, the roof was leaking, and the top floor ceiling was damp with mold. Worst of all, a young Russian man named Gribov had recently gone to sleep in a second-floor bed and failed to wake up. Michael had called in the health department, and the sheltering house was threatened with 2 weeks of quarantine. In the end, the inspector, who'd glanced over the immigrant's body with clinical distaste, decided against it. There were no signs of typhus or cholera, and no one could recall the man complaining of anything. But for the next week, the house's mood was tense and sombre, and Michael barely slept for worry. It seemed to him that the entire enterprise was hanging by a thread. His friends took in the new hollows under his eyes and told him he was working himself into an early grave. His uncle might have counselled him similarly, but Michael hadn't seen him in some time, not since he'd visited with a woman named Hava. He wondered vaguely if he should be worried. Was his uncle ill? Or was it something else? Michael's thoughts trailed back to the tall woman and her box of pastries, and the fond and protective way his uncle had looked at her. Could she? And he? But no, it seemed too ridiculous. He shook his head and resolved to check in on his uncle soon. But one thing led to another, and the top floor ceiling threatened to crumble, and Michael's attention was pulled elsewhere. And then, one morning, the sheltering house cook came into Michael's office and placed a box of almond macaroons on his desk. "The new girl at the bakery said to give these to you," she said, plainly amused. "For free, if you can believe. She found out I was from the sheltering house and insisted." The new girl? After a moment he realised and smiled. The cook's eyebrow went up. "A tall woman?" he asked, and the cook nodded. "She's a friend of my uncle's. I was the one who suggested she go to Rad's Inn for a job. Most likely she meant these as a thank you." "Oh, most likely," she replied airily. "Dora, I only met her once, and she's a widow, a recent one." The cook shook her head at his naivety and plucked a cookie from the box as he left. He lifted a macaroon in his palm. It was thick and slightly domed, but felt light as air. The top was decorated with almond slivers, arranged in a circle like flower petals. He popped it in his mouth and felt happy for the first time in weeks. Slowly, the golem grew more accustomed to the bakery and its rhythms. Her turns at the register were no longer so frightening. She was beginning to learn which customers bought the same thing every day, and which of them appreciated it when she made up their order in advance. She smiled at all of them, even when she didn't feel like it. Led by 100 little prompts, she very carefully tried to give each of them exactly what they wanted from her. And when she was successful, they would step away from the register with a lighter heart, glad that at least one thing, this one simple errand, had gone right that day. There were still problems to solve. She tended to work too quickly, and the customers would grow anxious or irritated, thinking that she was rushing them. And so she trained herself to slow down and ask after their health and their families, even when the line was long. She even learned to deal with the customers who were perpetually indecisive, who stood at the counter debating the merits of this or that. The breakthrough came when one day a woman told her to simply choose for her from what she herself liked best. But the golem had no particular favourites. She had tried all the pastries and could distinguish one from another, but for her there was no like or dislike. Each was merely a different experience. She thought of choosing at random, but then, in a moment of inspiration, she did what she rarely allowed herself to do. She focused on the woman and sifted through the tangle of her conflicting desires. Something economical would be best, but she also wanted something sweet. She had been feeling so low this week, what with the landlord raising the rent and then that awful argument with her Sammy. So didn't she deserve something nice for herself? But then it would be gone and she would feel no better, only poorer. I like the raisin challah on days like this, the golem said. It's sweet, but it's filling. And one challah lasts a long time. At once the woman beamed. That's it, she said. That's exactly what I wanted. And she paid for the challah and left, her spirits lifted. Happy with her success, the golem tried this technique on other indecisive customers. She was right more often than not, and tried not to take her failures personally. She was coming to realise that some people, for whatever reason, would never be satisfied. She still made mistakes on occasion, especially at the end of the day when a mental fatigue would set in and her thoughts would drift. She'd reach for the wrong thing, or call somebody by the wrong name, or make some other silly little error. Once in a while, a customer would walk out with the wrong order and then come back to complain. She would apologise profusely, horrified by her poor performance. But it was just as well, for otherwise her employers might have thought her too good to be true. Mr. Radzin was a meticulous accountant, and he had been over the figures repeatedly. There was no question. Sales were up, and for no good reason, while on the other side of the ledger his costs were shrinking. Intuition told him it had to do with the new girl. She might make a mistake or two at the register, but she never misread a recipe, or added the salt twice by accident, or left a sheet of cookies too long in the oven. She was never sick, never slow, never late. She was a miracle of productivity. Though there were also times when she acted as though she was from another world. One morning, Mrs. Radzin caught her peering oddly at an egg. "What's wrong with it, Havala? Is it bad?" Still staring at the egg, the girl had absent-mindedly replied, "Nothing. It's only, how do they make them the exact same size and shape every time?" Mrs. Radzin frowned. "How do who, dear? The chickens?" At her table, Anna gave a snort of laughter. The girl carefully put down the egg and said, "Excuse me," and disappeared into the back. "Don't tease, Anna," scolded Mrs. Radzin. "But what an odd question." "Have some compassion. She's a widow in mourning. It does strange things to the mind." Ignoring the women, Radzin went into the back for more flour. The door to the water closet was closed. He listened for the sounds of crying, but what he heard instead was her voice in a whisper. "You must be more careful. You must be more careful." He fetched the flour and left. A few minutes later, she emerged from the back as though nothing had happened and went to her silent work, ignoring Anna's periodic giggles. "What do you suppose is wrong with her?" Radzin asked his wife that night. "There's nothing the matter with her," she snapped. "I have eyes there, and so do you. She's different somehow." They were in bed together. Next to the wall, Abi and Selma lay curled on their pallets, sunk in the bone-deep sleep of the young. "I knew a boy growing up," Thea said. He couldn't stop counting things. Blades of grass, bricks on a wall. The other boys would gather round and yell numbers at him, because if he lost his place, he had to start all over again. He would just stand there counting with tears rolling down his face. It made me so angry. I asked my father why he couldn't stop, and he told me there was a demon in the boy's mind. He said I should stay away in case he did something dangerous. Did he? Do anything dangerous? Of course not. But he died the year before we left. A mule kicked him in the head. She paused and then said, I always wondered if he provoked it, deliberately. Radzin snorted. Suicide by mule. Everyone knew that animal had a temper. There would be a dozen better ways to do it. His wife rolled away from him. Oh, I don't know why I talk to you. If I say it's black, it must be white. If I see Hava standing behind any mules, I'll be sure to let you know. Awful man. Go boil your head like a turnip. They were quiet a moment, and then she said, I'd like to see a mule try to kick her. She'd braid its legs like a howler. Radzin laughed once, loud in the small room. Below them, the boy mumbled something. His sister shifted on her pallet. Their parents waited, tensed, but the children grew silent again. Go to sleep, Thea whispered, and leave me some covers for once. Radzin lay awake for a long time, listening to the breathing of his children and his wife. The next morning, he took his newest employee aside and told her he was raising her pay by 10 cents a day. You deserve it, he said gruffly, but one word to Anna and you'll be splitting it with her. I don't want her clamouring for money she doesn't deserve. He expected her to thank him, but instead she only stood, looking chagrined. Well, I just gave you a raise, girl. Aren't you happy? Yes, she said immediately. Yes, of course. Thank you. And I won't tell Anna. But she seemed more thoughtful than usual that day, and once or twice he saw her glance at Anna, her face full of a poorly disguised guilt. But it isn't fair that they should pay Anna less money than me, the Golem protested to Rabbi Meir. She can't work as hard as I can. It's not her fault. The Golem was pacing the rabbi's living room. It was a Friday night and the dishes from the small supper were still on the table. The Golem looked forward to her Sabbath evenings with the rabbi. It was the only time all week when she could ask questions and talk freely. But on this night, her dilemma eclipsed the rest of her thoughts. The rabbi, concerned, sat watching her pace. It's not as though I need the money, she muttered. I have nothing to spend it on. Why not buy something nice for yourself as a reward for your work? Perhaps a new hat. She frowned. I already have a hat. Is there something wrong with it? Not at all, he said, reflecting that her creator had certainly not given her a young woman's sense of frivolity. Chava, I understand why you're upset, and it speaks well of you. But from Radzin's perspective, you're worth more than Anna. To pay you both the same would be dishonest. Say I needed to buy a new kettle and could choose between a large one and a small one. You'd expect the larger kettle to cost more, wouldn't you? The Golem said, but what if the man who made the smaller kettle was poorer and had a larger family to look after? Wouldn't that figure into your decision? The rabbi sighed. Yes, I suppose it would. But if these facts were hidden from me, as they so often are, then all I would know is that there are two kettles in front of me, one large and one small. That's all Radzin knows as well. And please, Chava, stop pacing. You're making me dizzy. Instantly she stopped and sat in one of the parlour chairs, watching her hands twist together in her lap. Perhaps I should give away what I don't need, she said. Or, the Golem's face lit with the thought, I could give it to you. Instantly she saw the rabbi recoil from the idea. No, Chava, that's your money, not mine. But I don't need it. Perhaps not now. But one must always plan for the future. I've lived long enough to know that there will come a time when you'll need it, and probably when you least expect. Money is a tool, and you can do great good with it, for others as well as yourself. It sounded like good advice, but the golem was not completely mollified. All the rabbi's answers had been like this lately, pertaining to the matter at hand, but also addressing something larger that was yet to come. It made her uneasy. She felt as though he were trying to teach her as much as he could in as little time as possible. His cough hadn't worsened, but it was no better either, and she'd noticed that his clothing had begun to hang on him as though he'd shrunk. The rabbi insisted that all was as it should be. "I'm an old man, Chava," he said. "The human body is like a piece of fabric. No matter how well one cares for it, it frays as it ages." And what about a golem's body, she'd wanted to ask. "You say I won't age, but will I fray?" But she held her tongue. She'd begun to worry that questions such as these were too large a burden for both of them. "Besides," the rabbi went on, "from what you tell me about this Anna, she sounds like a less than serious-minded woman. Perhaps she can learn from your example, even if it doesn't come naturally to her." "Perhaps," the golem agreed. "She doesn't seem to wish me ill as much as before. But then she's been preoccupied with her new suitor. She thinks about him quite a lot and hopes he will walk her home from the bakery so they can..." Caught up in her description, she bit back the words just in time. "Yes, well..." The rabbi had coloured slightly. "She's a foolish girl if she's given herself to him before marriage, or at the very least before a promise of one." "Why so?" the golem asked. "Because she has everything to lose. Marriage has many benefits, and one of them is the protection of a child, the likely result of their current behaviour. An unmarried man is free to leave a woman, whatever condition she may be in, without consequence to himself. And what of the woman? She's now burdened and may not be able to support the child, or even herself. Women in these situations have turned to the ugliest of crimes out of desperation, and then lose whatever virtue they have left. From there, it's a short journey to disease, poverty, and death. It's no exaggeration to say that a night of pleasure could cost a young woman her life. I saw it far too often as a rabbi, even among the best families." "But she seems so happy," the golem thought. The rabbi stood and began to clear the dishes from the table, coughing once or twice. Quickly, the golem went to help him, and they did the dishes together in silence. "Rabbi, may I ask you something?" she said after a while. "It might embarrass you." The rabbi smiled. "I'll do my best, but don't expect miracles." "If the act of love is so dangerous, why do people risk so much for it?" The rabbi was quiet for a while. Then he said, "If you had to guess, what would you say?" The golem recalled what she knew of such longings, the nocturnal lusts of passers-by on the street. It excites them to be dangerous and to have a secret from the rest of the world. "That's one aspect of it, but not the whole," said the rabbi. "What you're missing is loneliness. All of us are lonely at some point or another, no matter how many people surround us. And then we meet someone who seems to understand. She smiles, and for a moment the loneliness disappears. Add to that the effects of physical desire and the excitement you spoke of, and all good sense and judgment fall away." The rabbi paused, then said, "But love founded only on loneliness and desire will die out before long. A shared history, tradition, and values will link two people more thoroughly than any physical act." They were silent for a while, and the golem thought about this. "Then this is what is meant by true love?" she asked. "Tradition and values?" The rabbi chuckled. "Perhaps that's too simplistic. I'm an old man, Chava, and a widower. I left all this behind years ago. But I do remember what it was to be young and to feel that there was no one else in the world but the beloved. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that I could see what truly lasts between a man and a woman." He trailed away, lost in memory, staring at the dish towel in his hand. In the light of the kitchen lamp, his skin looked sallow and spotted and as thin as eggshell. Had he always seemed so fragile? Rotfeld had looked like this, she thought, pale and sweating in the kerosene light. She'd always known that she would outlive the rabbi, but now the cold truth hit her as if for the first time. A pulse of grief ran through her, and the drinking glass that she'd been drying shattered in her hand. Both jumped at the noise. Clear shards fell glittering to the floor. "Oh, no," the golem said. "It's all right," said the rabbi. He bent to gather up the pieces with the dish rag, but the golem took it from him, saying, "I'm the one who broke it, and you might cut yourself." The rabbi watched as she swept up the glass and rinsed the nearby dishes. "Did something upset you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "I was only careless. It was a long day." He sighed. "It is late. Let's finish the dishes and then I'll take you home." It was nearing 11 o'clock by the time they reached her boarding house. The air had turned crisp with a cutting wind. The golem walked headfirst into it as though it were little more than a breeze. The rabbi walked hunched at her side, coughing occasionally into his muffler. "Come inside the parlour and get warm at least," she said at the boarding house steps. He shook his head, smiling. "I must be getting back. Good night, Chava." "Good night, Rabbi." And she watched him walk away, a small old man on a windy street. The rabbi's walk home from the golem's boarding house was tortuous. The wind battered his face and cut through his overcoat and thin trousers. He shook like a half-frozen animal. But at least he had succeeded. Not once during the evening had he thought of the satchel of books and papers hidden under his bed. What would have happened had she caught the edge of a fear or a desire? "I hope she will leave soon so that I can go back to my texts and find a way to control her." Might she have attacked him out of an instinct towards self-preservation? Or would she have agreed willingly, even encouraged his research? He'd never asked her whether she would prefer to have a master again, and now the thought of such a conversation made his throat tighten. In a sense, it would be like asking someone whether they'd like to escape their present difficulties by killing themselves. Constantly, he had to remind himself that she wasn't human. She was a golem and masterless. He forced himself to remember his own little golem at yeshiva, its indifferent destruction of the spider. They were not the same creature, but at heart they had the same nature. That cold remorselessness existed somewhere in her as well. But did she also have a soul? On its surface, the answer was a simple no. Only the Almighty could bestow a soul, as he had ensouled Adam with his divine breath. And the golem was a creature of man, not God. Any soul she could have would be at most partial, a fragment. If he turned her to dust, it might be an unwarranted act of destruction. It would not, however, count as murder. But these scriptural reassurances paled when faced with the golem herself. Her disappointments and triumphs, her clear concern for his ill health. She would talk in energetic tones about her work at the bakery and her growing confidence with the customers. And he saw not an animated lump of clay, but a young woman learning to live in the world. If he succeeded and bound her to a new master, he would be robbing her of all she'd accomplished. Her free will would disappear, to be replaced by her master's commands. Was that not murder of a sort? And if it came to it, would he have the strength to do it? By the time he reached his tenement, his footsteps had been reduced to a shuffle. Instead, the staircase stretched up into the dark. He took the steps one at a time, his hand clammy on the wood banister. He began coughing halfway up. By the time he reached his door, he couldn't stop. The key fumbled in the lock. Shaking hands lit the lamp. He went to the kitchen for water, but the cough deepened, gripping his entire body. He bent double, nearly knocking his head on the wash basin. Finally, the spasm slowed, then stopped. He lowered himself to the floor and breathed shallowly, the taste of blood in his mouth. He'd asked his doctor to come see him not a week ago. A bit of a cough, the rabbi had said. I only wanted to check. The doctor had spent long minutes with his cold stethoscope on the rabbi's chest and back, his expression growing more and more unreadable. At last he'd packed the equipment away in a battered leather case, saying nothing. How long? The rabbi asked. 6 months at most, the doctor said, and then turned away, tears on his cheeks. Yet another fear to keep from the golem. He drank a finger of schnapps to steady himself and put the kettle on for tea. His hands were not shaking so badly now. Good. There was work to be done.
Not the rabbi.
Not the rabbi.
Aww. He's so lovely. Are we gonna get all the men?
Yeah, very true. Oh, I'm sorry.
I quite like, honestly, that if he's going to die, it's, you know, from what seems like just a sort of a natural process, or like an infection, or, you know, it's just, he's at the end of a long life, and it's just bad timing. But also, I was thinking, the way that he was talking about her and having a soul, and whether it would be like murder, essentially, it was kind of just a take on enforced marriage or something like that. Like the difference between her having a master and her being married to, like, you know, a man who is her master, essentially. I just saw parallels between that as it was being described.
But between her having a soul and having a master?
Well, no, it's she either would have a master as a golem, or, you know, if because her original contract was essentially being married as well, and he's kind of, I don't think he's thinking that she would go off and get married because she's too different or anything like that. But yeah, it just seemed.
I love that passage about, bye Michael, bye Mike. I really love that passage about the soul at the end. I just think that's a really lovely little kind of like sort of meditation on her and her nature and what she is. And she's just doing her best. She's doing her best. Leave my clay baby alone.
And she's gonna get her dick. She is. It's going to be fine.
Then later on, she's going to meet a young aspiring chocolatier named Vienne.
Okay, I ship that.
Bomb ass cafe together.
Oh, that would be so good.
Do we
Okay, I
not
want-
ship Diane like everyone? Is this not a recurring theme?
Yeah.
She's the ultimate multi-purpose ship, as it were. Although we should say goodbye to the catch-up crew. We should say goodbye to the catch-up crew. Goodbye, catch-up crew. I hope you enjoyed it. We love you. Goodbye. Bye. 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 Bye.